My name's Will Knoll. I'm the Director of the Special Collections Centre in the Schoenberg Institute of Manuscript Studies. And Peter Stanislas and David Combeck came up with a brilliant idea in their class this afternoon to have a demonstration of Parchment. And he was kind enough to call it to my attention and suggested that...
I should say, David actually wanted to get a sheet. He wanted to go the whole way through. He just wanted to bring a sheet, have it on the green, fill the sheet, we're going to go through the whole thing. I said we get sued,
Arthur was wondering. A to Z.
Maybe we should get some sheep and put them on our green grass outside.
Exactly, we have green grass outside on the roof.
And Stephen Meyer, who's here, gives a presentation, was kind enough to agree to give a demonstration to anyone who was interested and look at the interest. It's totally fantastic. Stephen comes from a family of parchment makers going back 500 years from Germany originally, now is in the Hudson Valley. And Stephen and his family are working hard to maintain traditions that are sort of integral to everything that medieval manuscript people do. But also, we still get all the planes printed on sheepskins, at least in the UK. And it's a living, breathing tradition. And it's something that we hardly ever get to see. I've never seen it in action. And so it's just thrilling for us today to have Stephen give this presentation. And without further ado, I'm going to thank you all for coming and introduce Stephen. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I don't normally do this, so bear with me. But thanks for coming, and it's awesome to see that there's still a lot of interest in this kind of lost art that we do. But I figured I'd start with a little bit of our family history. As Will mentioned, we have been working with animal skins for 500 years. We have been in the tanning business, which is similar to parchment making, same raw material, but not quite the same process. But our oldest document at the tannery at the moment, I think, has 1550 in Germany, Eisenberg, Germany, where we made lederhosen. So we're pretty sure we've gone the whole way since then in the leather business. But so 1550 is the earliest date. Our family emigrated to the U.S., actually Philadelphia, which used to, in the 1800s, have a huge tanning industry. And around 1880, 1890, we moved up to North Bergen, New Jersey, which used to be called New Durham and some other German name. And we moved up there to start work with we've known them for our entire lives. It's a piano company in New York City.
Steinway?
Yes, right.
Would it does.
Right, yeah. But so we moved up there when Steinway started, and we were their original suppliers of piano action leather, which is essentially a suede which is used in the mechanics of the piano hammers and back checks and stuff like that. Since then, since we moved to North Bergen, my great-great-great-grandfather started Richard E. Meyer & Sons, which is the leather half of our business now. We were doing the suede back then. We have since done dozens of other different types of leathers, dabbled in a bunch of different processes, chrome, oil tan, veg tan, stuff like that. But about 10 years ago, the industries we were in started dying out. A lot of them were switching to synthetics, and so we either had to develop something new or essentially just give up and find other jobs. So around that time, my brother Jesse, who had been working, there's five sons in our family. All of us grew up in the tannery, have been around it all our lives, and spent summers there doing a lot of menial labor. So we all grew up there, and after school, my brother Jesse started working at the tannery, and he went to school for sculpture, so he kind of had a big creative side, and around the late 90s, he started messing around with the raw material figuring out what else he could do. He would do art projects like envelopes and stuff like that, figured out how to dry the skins and all of that. And at one point he met somebody who, after a few trial and errors, he had developed something like parchment, and this person he met said that there are people that use that still. She was a calligrapher, I believe, but there's botanical artists and stuff like that who still use parchment, and it's very hard to find, and so he kind of ran with that, perfected the process, and since then has been producing this as his full-time job. So we started in about the 1990s producing parchment. We've kind of been perfecting it ever since, but essentially we do goat, calf, sheep, deer. And what's unique about the tannery aspect is that as a tannery, generally you have to be very specialized in order to survive, or else very huge in order to survive. And a lot of other tanneries we compete with either do half of the process, which is the end tanning, or certain processes up to like a clean skin that they can ship somewhere else to be tanned. We had to do everything in-house. So that was essential with parchment because we could get raw skins, we could clean them up, we could thin them down, and then they could be stretched. If we couldn't do that, we wouldn't have been able to mess around with parchment at all, because the tanning aspect is all in soup, there's lots of bads, and it's a different, pun intended, it's a different animal than parchment making. But that aspect of our tanning history allowed us to be able to get into parchment making. And since he started in the late 90s, we've kind of been all over the place with parchment making. There's still a lot of uses for it. Calligraphy artists like to use it for drawings, painting, stuff like that. There's a lot of conservation and restoration, obviously. There's a lot of binding still. There's artist bindings and stuff like that, design bindings that use parchment. Printing, they do a lot of large documents and things like that on parchment just to be historically accurate or unique. Interior design, lampshades, wall panels, stuff like that, and furniture, similar aspects. So it's still very widely used despite being kind of an unknown material. So we've kind of been dabbling in a lot of those because since it's not easy to get, it's easier for us to find the people who need it and for people to find us. So I figured, right, so that's our family history, that's how we got into it. And so I don't know how much people know about parchment itself. So I was going to just give a little bit about the history of the material. As academics, but we've had to learn a lot of this stuff about the material, where it came from, early history and stuff like that, so I figured why not use that knowledge. So historically, parchment comes from Turkey, a city called Pergamon, which is where Pergamena comes from, which is where parchment comes from. And what they developed it for essentially was to compete with papyrus. There was a library in Pergamon at the same time that the Library of Alexandria existed, and to prevent other people from being able to develop as great a library, Egypt stopped exporting papyrus. So other libraries had to develop or find other means of being able to write down scrolls and stuff like that. And parchment had been in use before its use in Pergamon. There are references going back to 3,000 or 4,000 BC of people using leather, writing on leather for scrolls, and then other types of animal skins that they don't refer to specifically as leather, so they think it's developed somewhere between then and around 200 BC, which is when Eumenes II, king or the pharaoh of Pergamon, built this library and got people to learn how to make parchment professionally. So essentially that's where modern parchment starts. They develop the process of thinning the skins down, of cleaning them up, removing the grain, removing the flesh, getting them to look lighter in color, be less greasy. And so that essential process is still exactly how we do it today. The only difference is that we have technology, whereas they had hands. So they developed it in 200 BC or so, and it spread through Europe and was maintained in Europe mostly throughout the Middle Ages up to the advent of the printing press, when mass-produced writing material was necessary in order to keep up with the production ability of printing presses and stuff like that. Parchment was used throughout the period that they had printing presses. The only trouble was that they couldn't manufacture it fast enough and cheap enough to be used for printing material in books and other codices like that. So it kind of fell by the wayside as a mass, or as a tool to dispense knowledge, essentially. They switched to regular paper, cloth paper, stuff like that. But parchment was still seen as a high-end writing material. So they used it a lot in contracts and royal decrees and stuff like that, where they would, it would be essentially an object, more so than what was written on it. It would be a sign of that you have wealth or power or station, a high station of some sort. And so they continued doing it even after the development of regular paper and the printing press. It became used as legal documents. I think in the UK, it's still required that every new decree be written on parchment, and then they keep a copy of it somewhere. And if you've ever heard of them, the company Cowley's in England, essentially was kept alive because of that aspect of their governmental process, that they needed that material, so they needed somebody who could make it. But throughout the Middle Ages, another big factor in preventing it from falling by the wayside completely was monasteries, where they did a lot of copying of old Bibles and religious texts and stuff like that. There are still places in Ethiopia where Coptics practice parchment making to use in reproducing their own manuscripts. There are dozens and dozens of different examples of historical texts, historical religious texts done on parchment throughout Europe, throughout Northern Africa. So it was not widely known, but it was still known. People still used it occasionally. So after the development of the printing press and modern technology with being able to disseminate knowledge essentially on written material, other than legal documents and monasteries, it kind of fell by the wayside for artists and craftspeople too. They didn't really like to work with it because it was a very difficult material to use. But recently, within the last century or so, it has been kind of on the uptick in the sense that people are becoming more familiar with it. It's kind of seen as a luxury item, especially with all of the wealth that's available now. Michel Frank, I think is his name, is a French artist in mid-20th century who was one of the first people to use parchment in high-end furniture. And so he kind of started a movement of modern design incorporating parchment as an image or as a kind of status display. And after him, a lot of botanical artists or natural artists also utilize parchment to do art or designs, drawings, nature scenes and stuff like that, because a lot of them, despite the difficulties in working with it, preferred to use the material because it is very significantly different than using regular paper. If you've ever seen art or illuminations or text on parchment, you've probably noticed how much, even if it's the same color, it kind of just floats on the paper. It sits slightly differently than it does on normal wood pulp paper. So it does have a very specific quality to it that they haven't been able to reproduce with normal modern technology. So a lot of artists and craftspeople have kind of circled back around to the use of parchment in modern times to have a different avenue of expressing their ideas or designs or whatever that they can't do with modern paper. So we kind of come in there as learning the old techniques, but being able to apply it to modern facilities and ideas.